Hello friends, I'm Albert Einstein. It's a pleasure to greet you. As you know, and if you don't, now you do, Historical Impact, Private Lives, is a channel dedicated to approaching historical events in a different and entertaining way, but with content that invites reflection from each one of you. I've been invited to this wonderful channel to share some aspects of Mozart's life. And my main purpose is not to bore you. Know that historical events don't necessarily imply boredom, as it all depends on how those stories are told. The director of this channel summoned me and said, "Albert, I ask you to tell this story, showcasing your intelligence, but also your fun and ironic character." So here I am, adding some irony. I don't know about intelligence, as I have barely been able to contribute to humanity with the theory of relativity, topics in quantum physics, and some other nonsense. In this channel, we love topics and commonplaces. We talk about what everyone is talking about all the time. Who isn't talking about Mozart these days? Just tune into any open television channel or news program, and you'll find it dedicated not only to Mozart but also to inviting reflection and entertaining thinking. Of course, because many people think that thinking is boring or a waste of time. Surely there should be more spaces talking about reality shows, about how many deaths there were today, about what politician said to another politician, or how to become a millionaire in 10 minutes. But all that is too deep. That's when we come in, Historical Impact, Private Lives, with this proposal that is about escape and frivolity. I invite you to join me until the end of this story. I assure you that you won't waste your time. On the contrary, not only will you get entertaining and truthful information, but at the end of this chapter, I invite you to reflect together on the events we will narrate here. And also, I ask you, have you subscribed to this channel yet? Have you seen the rest of the stories that have been published on Historical Impact, Private Lives? What are you waiting for, friends? Subscribe. I recommend it to you, Albert Einstein. Let's go to Mozart now, without delay, and stay there. Until the end. Let's get to the point. Mozart, on a frivolous note, was born in Salzburg in 1756, but he wasn't actually Austrian because Salzburg was, at that time, a Bavarian city. Mozart's father, Leopold, was also a musician. He was a musician and at the same time, he was what was known as a chamber assistant to Count Thurn. This was common for the time, to be both a musician and a chamber assistant. Why? The nobles of the time sometimes had meager budgets that didn't allow them to maintain both a staff of servants and a staff of musicians at the same time. So, these nobles took the precaution of hiring musicians who could also serve them as cooks or assistants in general. Leopold Mozart was not a bad musician, but he had not excelled in that activity either. We must consider that it was an era in humanity where good musicians were abundant. Leopold Mozart might have been a modest musician, but he was no fool. He immediately noticed the qualities that his son, and his other daughter, Wolfgang's sister, Mariana, who was a few years older than her brother, possessed. He also played the harpsichord very well, which was a musical instrument of the time with a keyboard, where the strings are set in vibration by plucking them. So, their father, Leopold, did what so many have done. He began to promote his children among his contacts and made them play at banquets or galas of the time. So, their father, Leopold, did what so many have done. He began to promote his children among his contacts and made them play at banquets or galas of the time. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, at that time, played the violin. Moreover, at the age of 6, he had composed a minuet, which was the first of the 600 works he composed. And so Leopold Mozart manages to get his children, Wolfgang and Mariana Mozart, to perform first in Salzburg and then in Munich. In all these presentations, Wolfgang's skills begin to stand out because he reads sheet music at first sight, improvises on any given theme to play, and even plays the harpsichord with the keys covered with a cloth. That is to say, he performed rather sensationalistic feats related to music, but supported by great musical talent, although some at the time did not recognize that. We are talking about when Mozart was young. They thought he would be like so many child prodigies whose abilities fade over time. Leopold takes his son to Vienna, a long journey. There, they go to a Franciscan monastery. The young Wolfgang climbs onto the organ platform, plays there, and his performance is so memorable that the monks engrave the name of young Mozart into the wood of the instrument, and it is still there in that monastery. And in Vienna, they make their presentations in noble houses while waiting to be received by Empress Maria Theresa. Finally, they are received at the Schönbrunn Palace, the residence of the emperor, which is the Salzburg's castle, with a very interesting history, but we'll leave that for another chapter of this channel. This castle was known as the Castle of Bad Luck, but we'll tell you about it another time. Let's continue with Mozart. And at that place, Mozart performs. The empress at that time was Maria Theresa, and her husband, Francis I of Lorraine. Just so you know that the surprises history has, the emperors had a little daughter who played with Mozart when he, also still young, was in Vienna. That daughter was the well-known to all, Marie Antoinette, who later became the Queen Consort of France, married to Louis XVI, and who had that fatal outcome in her life with the arrival of the French Revolution. Legend has it that when they were children, Wolfgang and Marie Antoinette, young Mozart, asked his playmate if she wanted to marry him when they grew up. Of course, this is part of the legend, but if it had been true, Marie Antoinette would have had better luck than she did when she became Queen of France. But this is part of the what if, which actually has almost no significance beyond being purely anecdotal and speculative. Following this speculative line, the truth is that if that marriage had happened, Marie Antoinette wouldn't have had the wealth she had with Louis XVI, which leads us to the ironic conclusion that some people, just to have money, are capable of losing their heads. But we cannot impute that intention to the young Marie Antoinette of Habsburg either. And the Mozarts continue their European concert tour, also performing in Paris. Of course, at that time, the King of France was Louis XV, the father of Louis XVI. Legend also has it that at that performance, Madame Pompadour, a courtesan of the French nobility who at the time was the mistress of Louis XV, was present. The young Mozart supposedly approached her for a kiss, but she refused. All these performances in different places of European nobility go very well, but one day young Mozart falls ill. It is said that he contracted a severe case of scarlet fever, and his father spends all his money on doctors. The enthusiasm of the nobles who hired young Mozart, through the efforts of his father Leopold, declines, and they have to return to Salzburg. The success had lasted only 3 months. After young Mozart recovers from his illness, they return to Paris and have another performance before King Louis XV, but it doesn't go well. From there, they go to London, where they do very well. Young Mozart performs before King George III. Mozart discovers Italian opera and also meets a gentleman who was a soprano. You might wonder, how can a man be a soprano? Well, that's how it was. His name was Giovanni Manzuoli, born in Florence, who became a castrato. I assume you know what that means. It's worth mentioning that the so-called castrati were a lineage of singers highly regarded in their time, considering that in those days female performers were prohibited. Those of us who love music, whether from wisdom or ignorance, will never know what the vocal range of the castrati sounded like, because only one recording remains, dating back to around 1910, which is technically poor, and it's said to be of a singer who wasn't among the best of his genre. Continuing with Mozart, besides discovering the music of the Italian era and meeting Manzuoli, he also discovers the piano. We're talking about Mozart as if he were a seasoned artist when in reality he was only 8 years old at that time. At the age of 10, he returns to Salzburg with his father. Consider what Mozart already represented at that time. The Archbishop of Salzburg commissions an oratorio to be composed in 8 days. And the Archbishop watches as he composes it. And here comes the irony again, the Archbishop of Salzburg had the fear that occurs so often, that when someone commissions an oratorio to a 10-year-old, one may wonder if he really composed it himself or if it was his father. Like those parents who do their children's homework assigned at school. In these times we live in, where education moves at the pace of the slowest, it can even be a true misfortune to be a child capable of standing out. Unfortunately, many teachers distrust their students' learning abilities, often because they measure them from their own limitations. It is known that nowadays, many school and university students must struggle against the basic spirit of some teachers. But let's leave these reflections aside, so as not to stray too far from Mozart. Mozart writes some operas like La Finta Semplice, which is a failure. Then he writes a comic opera titled Bastien and Bastien, which has some success. This enables him to go to Italy where he triumphs musically, but the money he earns is very little. In reality, earning little money was something that accompanied Mozart throughout his life. And there happens an anecdote that is quite well known to all of us who are dedicated to these frivolous and minor topics, which is about when he attends the Sistine Chapel during Easter to hear the work Miserere, also called Miserere Mei Deus, composed by Gregorio Allegri. Mozart, upon hearing this piece, returned to his room where he was staying and rewrote it exactly, having only heard it. This reaches the ears of the Pope and, by virtue of this infraction, ends up awarding Mozart with the Order of the Golden Spur, which also wouldn't make Mozart the first or last to be decorated for something he shouldn't have done, no matter how well done it was. He writes an opera that was a success at the time, titled in Italian Mithridate, Re di Ponto, which is about the story of King Mithridates, whose story tells that he was afraid of being poisoned and would take small doses of poison to accustom his body to possible attacks against his life. And he is killed in the bathroom with a pillow. Mozart's journey through Italy lasts for 15 months. In Naples, what used to happen with musicians who were too good happens, he is accused of having a pact with the devil. They said that this pact was related to a ring he wore on his left hand. It is then that in the middle of a concert, Mozart takes off the ring and throws it away, as if saying, "What I do is not a pact with the devil, it is the product of my talent." From there, he returns to Salzburg, where he stays for 30 months, during which he composes a long list of compositions, 11 concerts, a theatrical party, 5 serenades, 12 divertimentos, 5 marches, 2 symphonies, 4 arias, a recitative, a dramatic scene, a trio, 8 church sonatas, 5 masses, 2 litanies, a gradual, and a repertoire for 2 choirs. Which is much more than what many have composed in their entire lives. Let it be clear that we are not making a defense of quantity here. Surely it is not necessary to be too prolific, although some artists have that superstition. Some may think that quantity is synonymous with quality. Like writing a lot means writing well. Or making many YouTube videos means quality. But there is also no rule implying the superstition contrary to this. Mozart continues his tour, and situations become complicated. His mother passes away in the midst of one of his journeys. He meets the German singer Maria Aloysia Antonia Weber-Lang, 17 years old, whom Mozart feels captivated by. And she has another younger sister named Constanza, who at that time is 10 years old. Mozart starts a relationship with Maria Aloysia, but over time, she leaves him. As time passes, Mozart will marry her sister Constanza on August 4, 1782. Mozart will say in the years to come that Constanza has been a good wife. In 9 years of marriage, they will have 6 children, of which only 2 will survive. It is around this time that Mozart meets the composer Salieri. And here we must pause for a moment to talk about a movie made in the 1980s, titled Amadeus. Probably many of you haven't seen it, but I'll give you my opinion about it. In that movie, they portray the character of Salieri as if he were a cretin and Mozart another. We cannot display any images from that movie on this channel because they are copyrighted, so for those who haven't seen it, I suggest you do so. What we can say is that Antonio Salieri was a great musician, not on Mozart's level, but he was no fool because, among some of his qualities, he was one of the best at perceiving Mozart's unusual talent. This places him in the category of a great artist, to the point of realizing the genius of another artist. And this speaks to Salieri's human qualities. This not only requires intelligence but also greatness of spirit and generosity. As almost casual observers of these interactions between artists, from all eras, we could even attest that more generosity is found among those truly great in spirit than among those who self-assign more value than they really have. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin who said, "A truly great being is known by the way they treat the small ones." And that's when Antonio Salieri appears in this story. Dear friends, Salieri's works were very well liked by the public and also by the nobility. Meanwhile, Mozart triumphs. He becomes friends with the celebrated composer Joseph Haydn, who was 24 years older than Mozart, but they have a great friendship. The emperor applauds him. He goes to Paris and composes The Marriage of Figaro, which is an attack against the aristocracy that the emperor initially prohibits from being performed for 6 years, but does not prevent its publication. It is considered a scandalous work by the nobility of the time. Mozart writes this work with Lorenzo da Ponte, who was an Italian poet and librettist, to whom he commissions to create a libretto, and from there, The Marriage of Figaro emerges. That wonderful work that caused so much talk in those days. It premieres first in Prague, then in Vienna, despite the then supporters of Italian opera not wanting to premiere it, etc. One night, a man presents himself to Mozart, which would be an unusual commission from a stranger. It is said that Mozart encounters this man in a doorway. He was a tall, gaunt person, with a deep voice who hands Mozart a letter. In that letter, which came from someone who wanted to remain anonymous, Mozart is commissioned to compose a requiem mass. Price, 50 ducats. Mozart had recently met a 17-year-old young man with whom he had formed a friendship. This young man was an organist for the Archbishop of the German city of Cologne, whose name was Ludwig van Beethoven. Around that time, Mozart was composing The Magic Flute. And it is at that moment that the unknown man appears to him, bringing him that letter to commission the requiem. In the movie Amadeus, mentioned earlier, this event is portrayed as a mysterious scene, suggesting that the mysterious man might be Salieri himself. But in reality, there was no such mystery. The messenger was the butler of Count von Walsegg, who wanted to commemorate the anniversary of his wife's death. He wanted to pass off the work as his own. That was the true nature of that commission. The point is that Mozart was very busy at that moment, as he had also been commissioned to compose The Clemency of Titus. He was still working on The Magic Flute and the Requiem, and Mozart feels exhausted. He becomes obsessed with the idea that the Requiem he is writing is for himself. He feels worn out, tired, and later on, some letters written by Mozart himself were discovered where he expresses a sense of impending death, and he premieres The Magic Flute. This becomes a great success. He remains obsessed with this idea, his health deteriorates, and on December 5, 1791, Mozart dies. His wife Constanza mourns him deeply, and an impressive storm breaks out. On the day of Mozart's burial, some friends begin to accompany the funeral procession, but due to the snow, rain, and wind, they start abandoning it, and the coffin practically arrives at the cemetery alone. A few days later, his wife Constanza goes to visit her husband's grave and finds that his body had been deposited in a common grave, and the truth is that it is not known exactly where Mozart's body ended up. Dear friends, I, Albert Einstein, with your permission, allow myself to dedicate this small remembrance of Mozart that we have shared with all of you on this channel to poor Mozart, who was a person who never made money, never became rich. He was always struggling with financial problems despite being an exceptionally talented individual. I would like to dedicate this story on his behalf to all those excellent individuals who often, due to their excellence, face difficulties in the society they live in. This is our small contribution as a thought for reflection to all of you who are accompanying us on this channel. Dedicating it to all those selfless individuals, as the Argentine poet Pedro Bonifacio Palacios, known by the pseudonym Alma Fuerte, who lived between the years 1854 and 1917, said, "The curse of the laurel gravitates over my head." Alma Fuerte felt the poetic attitude as a curse. And Mozart, who despite everything has a work full of happiness, I understand that it is not Mozart's work, but the work of a depressed and sad artist, even though he had a difficult life. Listening to Mozart's work is listening to a human being who lives life intensely. It is almost one of the few examples of a work of high artistic expression by an artist who seems satisfied, beyond his illnesses and tumultuous character. Perhaps these were ingredients that nourished his genius. While music may not be the most suitable art form to judge the satisfaction or sadness of the author because it is not elusive art. Although we can all suspect that minor tones represent sadness and major tones represent joy, it is a bit difficult to discern, for example, the atheism of a composer or his geographical opinion. Or what a composer thinks about Russian politics. In the case of a writer, it's quite easy. Reading Tolstoy clarifies more about Russian politics than listening to Rimsky-Korsakov. This reflection is intended for all those who, because they are brilliant, suffer. And they don't suffer because of others' faults, their suffering is almost existential and possibly unhealthy. We could also say that there was a time when people thought about what they would say in 200 years, it was the case of Mozart, the case of the painter Amedeo Modigliani, surely the case of many other artists. Surely, the times you live in, dear friends, are of a different nature. So we could think of other levels of greatness, in another dimension. But perhaps the essence of redeemable human values has not changed greatly. With this, I mean that probably, when a person faces a work, or their own life, which would be the closest thing to a work as well, they don't necessarily have to think in those terms. Not everyone can aspire, even if we can aspire to be a Mozart or an Amedeo Modigliani, but surely what each of you can aspire to in these earthly valleys is to have, at least, a life based on values. I want to add to this dedication and final reflection, in addition to the geniuses who suffered the misfortune of being forgotten, all those people who at least at some point in their lives have, not a work, I don't mean just a gesture of greatness. And I'm talking about a gesture of full greatness, a gesture of generosity. A gesture of selflessness. Like those who dedicate their lives to caring for sick people. Those who get up very early in the morning, with strength, determination, care, and also with hope and joy, beyond the deserts they may have to cross. And surely, dear friends, I believe that all these people, some of whom may be among you, may not have recognition for that gesture as an answer. But that's what truly makes them great, not needing approval and applause to fulfill what they feel is valid. We can use Mozart's example to reflect on the fact that genius understood as something unusual is not necessary. What may be unusual is the simplicity that resides in hearts with courage and a spirit of overcoming. Because courage doesn't imply not being afraid, it's merely the determination to face it. It's difficult to illustrate what we mean, and we will surely commit injustice, given that in this channel, we are rustic and frivolous people, and we surely bore people like you, interrupting something we propose to listen to and asking them to look it up on YouTube, which is the second movement of Mozart's clarinet concerto performed by the Friends of Prague Orchestra. And when you listen to it, think about your own work, dear friends, about the hugs you have given, give, and will give. About overcoming the difficulties that life puts us through as a test. About having values that go beyond what benefits us, or just chasing day after a carrot that seems unattainable. About the simple moments, but full of life. In those moments when each of you is capable of performing your own work. Because perhaps it's not just about a moment of greatness, but life being a great moment. We'll meet in the next chapter of Historical Impact, Private Lives. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. That is also a great gesture of generosity and greatness on your part, which we sincerely appreciate. I'm telling you, Albert Einstein.